Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the side event on energy security and climate action. Two sides of one coin. We're delighted to be here. Thank you for the German government for the invitation at the German Pavilion. We are in the midst of a global energy crisis, unprecedented in almost half a century. We are facing high energy prices, disrupted supply, that are having devastating effects on countries and economies and people, especially at a time where some of them are just recovering from the COVID pandemic. In response to this crisis, governments have introduced a range of short-term measures and policies, such as consumer subsidies, direct grants, new trade deals to diversify imports, gas-saving plans, and accelerated renewable deployment to ensure energy security. However, we must not lose sight of our climate commitments while we're trying to address a short-term crisis. Climate action and sustainable energy transition this decade remain critical to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century to keep the temperatures within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. Locking in fossil fuel emissions in the long term must therefore be avoided. We have put together a wonderful panel for you today. We have, starting from my right side, Mr. Stefan Wenzel. He is the Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. To his right, we have Kadri Simpson. He's the EU Commissioner for Energy. Followed by Rudy Dix. He's the Head of Project Management Office in the Private Office of the South African President. And lastly, we have Mary Warlick, Deputy Executive Director of the IEA. Welcome. And I am Juan Pablo Sornio. I am a program lead at E3G in Berlin. So, Stefan, why don't we start with you? The energy crisis in Germany hit quick and hard. What are the measures your government is taking in the short term to address it, and how do they fit with your climate and energy transition goals?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Thank you very much for the invitation, and dear colleagues on the panel, it's an interesting question for the Europeans. It was on the 24th of April of February that the Russian war against Ukraine begins, and at the 8th of March, the Prime Minister of the European Union met in Versailles, and they launched the Repower EU plan. And the Repower EU plan, for example, wants to strengthen efficiency, wants to strengthen the goals to build up renewable energy, and is a strong answer and a very fast answer of the European Union. And on the same time, we starting to accelerate our law, for example, the renewable energy law, the law for wind on land, the law for wind on sea, and we started initiatives to strengthen efficiency together with our colleagues in Europe. And so we want to have 4 times as much solar energy in Germany as in the moment. We want to have the double the wind on land. We want to double the wind on in the North Sea. So we want to be much faster than before. The answer the Prime Ministers gave in Versailles was, we want to go faster to energy transition. We want energy sovereignty. We want to get rid of Russian gas as fast as possible and rid of fossil fuels in the whole. And so we are in a very difficult situation, because at the same time we saw the prices rising very much too, and there are a lot of discussions about what happens because of the high prices for households, the social impacts, and the impact for companies. But in the moment, I think we also implemented some very strong tools to handle the situation.
But Can you ensure that Germany will definitely meet the climate targets that it set up?
We have a climate protection law, climate action law, which is committed to the 1.5 goal from the Paris Agreement, and we have an expert group who always examines everything that government does, and if it's not enough, they go to the parliament, they go to the public and say, here, you have to do more, and there you haven't done enough. For example, in the moment we talk about traffic, because this expert gremium said you must do more to save emissions in traffic. And now we discussing in the coalition about the climate action fast track program to reach these goals. And therefore, we are working on it. It's not easy, but we are very strong committed to the 1.5, and we don't want a new fossil lock-in.
Thank you, Stefan. Kadri, let me go to you. How did the energy crisis impact the way the EU as a bloc thinks about energy security?
Good afternoon, first of all, to everybody, and thank you for this question, because indeed we are facing right now a triple challenge, extremely high and volatile energy prices, then the risk for our security of supply, and of course climate crisis has not disappeared. And I am not lying if I am saying that this situation where we do find ourselves was no surprise, because Russia has once already used their fossil fuels as a weapon against the EU. It was 2009 and it lasted only 13 days. But since then, it was very clear for us that we should not leave any single member state in the situation where they are dependent on only one single pipeline coming from Russia. And actually, we were much better prepared for this to happen this year, because even this summer we opened several alternative pipelines. The most prominent one is Baltic pipe connecting Poland with Norway, but also interconnections connecting Bulgaria with Greece, who is now connected since 2 years with via TANAP with Azeris. Then interconnectors between Poland and Lithuania, interconnectors between Finland and Estonia, interconnector pipeline from Poland to Slovakia. So we do have now a pretty solid network of pipelines that allow us to support our member states also via reverse flow. And then on top of that, there is an impressive network of LNG terminals. So we were prepared for that, and one lesson learned is that never again we should find ourselves in a situation where one dominant supplier is covering 40% of our gas demand. But on top of that, our response is that we cannot replace every single molecule that Russia has cut with alternative supplies. This is unfair towards the rest of the world, because Russia is not able to sell this gas to nobody else. They don't have alternative pipeline connections, so they are flaring and venting. And that means that if we are reaching out to other trusted suppliers, then they cannot increase their production so fast.
Of course.
So we have to prioritize savings. We do so. Since July, there is in place the agreement between EU member states that for this winter, each month, we cut our gas consumption by 15% compared to 5-year average. And then, of course, we will prioritize also fuel switch, where we can replace natural gas with electricity, where we can accelerate renewables, we will do so. And this is also one of the reasons why we are, when we presented our Repower EU plan, then one of the main pillars of that was dedicated for permitting, because otherwise, if we do not simplify the permitting procedures, it takes years. And it might be too late, because we all know by 2030, when our Fit for 55 proposals have been materialized, then anyway our consumption would be down by 30% of gas. But we don't have this time. So we are really operating under emergency mode since last autumn. But we also learned our lessons already from the previous gas crisis.
And I guess the question that's on everybody's minds now is, knowing that the EU committed to the Green Deal, Fit for 55, Repower EU, is when can we expect an NDC that is enhanced from the EU, and how much can we expect that enhancement to be?
We know that our Fit for 55 package was very ambitious 2 years ago when we presented that. And I have to admit that I was expecting that these will be difficult negotiations, especially with member states, because we ask them to increase the renewable targets significantly. So current target is 32% of energy mix, and we ask them to upgrade it to 45. But saying that, in reality, member states are willing to do even more. So we have several member states who have announced that by 2030, their whole electricity consumption will be covered by renewables. So ambition is incredibly higher than it seemed possible only 2 years ago, and this is also the basis why we can believe that our target for 2030 and reducing our greenhouse gases might be higher. But of course, at first, we have to finalize our negotiations with our co-legislators. First files have been negotiated and the outcome is known, but two major files, Renewable Directive and Energy Efficiency Directive, are still under the process of making. And based on these outcomes, we can announce then what is our target. But I do suspect that we will be more ambitious than we ever dared to believe only 2 years ago.
Thank you, Kadri. We're all looking forward to that. Now, to you, Rudy. Energy security has been an issue in South Africa already well before the current crisis. How has the Ukraine war impacted energy security in South Africa, if at all?
It hasn't. Our energy security has been a factor, of course, and this has largely been attributed to the fact that we've not been able to build additional capacity since 2007. This has, of course, caused a shortage in energy supply as a result of not having a new build. Of course, government took a decision some time back then when the first energy crisis came into effect to build 2 new coal-powered fire stations. That is the last 2 coal-powered fire stations that were built. The energy crisis, of course, has perpetuated for quite a bit of time. And we have, more recently, the President has announced an energy intervention plan specifically to deal with this. I mean, from a technical level, we're short between 4 and 6 gigawatts of electricity at any given point in time. So in a sense, what has happened is that, one could probably describe this as a perfect storm, because it has allowed us to be able to do a number of interventions, including reform and the restructuring of the electricity sector. Our sector, of course, is largely coal-based. We've recently, of course, concluded a Just Energy Transition Partnership with the international partner group countries. We've launched last week the investment plan around our first phase of a commitment towards meeting our NDC targets, our range that is there. It's, of course, dependent on the amount of resources, and the more ambition that we are able to achieve depends on whether we're able to raise sufficient funding to pay for that without creating significant debt for ourselves. But the perfect storm also allowed us to be able to restructure, for example, Eskom, our major utility, which has been a vertically integrated structure for 100 years, and in a sense, restructuring it into generation, distribution, and transmission, creating a transmission entity. During the course of last year, for the first time, we were able to make some significant reforms in legislation, which is referred to embedded Schedule 2, which is referred to embedded generation, or SSEG, but private sector generation, and the cap that we set was about 1 megawatt, right? A 1 megawatt cap. So you could, for example, produce electricity up to 1 megawatt without having to license. And the license process, as you quite know, can be quite onerous. In October, November last year, that cap was raised to 100 megawatt. So you could now produce at utility scale, without the state having to sign off on an offtake, in the same way we've done our renewable energy independent power producer program, also the participation of the private sector. This year, that cap was removed. Now, by just changing that cap, has significantly changed the landscape, the energy landscape in South Africa, because it allowed private sector generators to produce at utility scale at a level never ever seen before. So let me give you a good example of this perfect storm, is that, since we removed the cap last year, we have 9 gigawatts of potential private sector generation capacity that would come on stream in the next 24 to 36 months, right? This is more than 100 different projects valued in excess of a few 100 billion rand. So that perfect storm of having a shortage of electricity supply, reforming the electricity market, tweaking legislation and allowing for private sector generation has created a perfect opportunity for private sector generation in a space that has always been a closed market space where the major utility has always been the producer of electricity and of course, the distributor of that electricity.
I think we have all witnessed that transformation
Yes, absolutely.
closely, and we were very happy to see the JETP being announced at the last COP. So similar to the questions that we've asked the colleagues before you, how does that perfect storm impact South Africa's climate targets? According to the Climate Action Tracker, South Africa wants to meet net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
How is this transformation making South Africa more able to achieve that?
So transition is not cheap, right? I mean, you've seen the cost. You've seen the cost for of the investment plan. That's only for the first 5 years, by the way, and for 3 sectors, right? Electricity, automotives, and green hydrogen, right? So it comes at a cost of $98 billion for 5 years, right? So I mean, in our view, we don't believe there's a shortage of money. Certainly, there's money available that has been made by the EU and the US for the war in Ukraine, right? So certainly there should be money available also for importance of supporting developed countries, Africa, for example, in meeting their just energy transition targets and ensuring that the high end, the ambition that we set in that range is met. The problem, of course, is that it is largely dependent on whether we're able to raise that resources and whether we're able to avoid debt. South Africa cannot avoid that debt, and therefore it's important this IPG partnership that we have on the JETP has been an important stepping stone. Remember, it's an initial amount. Short $90 billion because there's an $8.5 billion that is already committed. And I think what has been quite interesting is that we have to work pretty hard to ensuring that we meet that ambitious target, which is the bottom end of the range, by the way, the $98 billion funding for our NDC. But certainly, again, it depends on the amount of resources that is available. The most important point, Juan Pablo, is that we have to work towards implementation of the Just Energy Transition investment plan. And that's going to be quite critical for us in ensuring that we, use the money in a manner that I think that can achieve some of those particular targets. Decommissioning in line with the policy environment that we've taken around coal-powered fire stations, the transformation that is required in the automotive sector. South Africa has quite an advanced ICE automotive sector. Its largest trading partner in autos is the European Union. The ease of carbon tax adjustment introduced in 2035, it would affect us quite significantly so. So we need to develop our sectors that is able to compete and, of course, continue to have an export to the European and those particular markets. And, of course, green hydrogen, so industrial usage, hard sectors to move off. This is going to be an important part of what we're going to have to require to do. So we're quite happy that we've been able to put together this plan, quite costly and shocking, as you can see, but it's something that I think we're going to work on quite hard, and
Yeah.
we're going to have to get the implementation right.
Thank you, Rudy. We all want to see how that works out, and congratulations on putting the plan together. Let's not forget, if we want green hydrogen, we need renewables and lots of them.
Absolutely.
Mary, let me come to you. So we've heard from Europe, South Africa, Germany within Europe. How is the crisis being felt more? It's a crisis that is being felt more fiercely in Europe. So the question is, has this changed the perception of energy security worldwide? And how are people sort of balancing the short term with the long term in other places?
Yes, well, the short answer, I think, is absolutely. And I'd just like to start by saying I really like the way that this panel, the discussion has been framed. Energy security and climate action, two sides of one coin. And it's precisely the position that the IEA has been taking as well. Yes, we're in the midst of what we're calling the first truly global energy crisis, with consequences on countries, first and foremost, of course, right here, right in Europe, but also all around the world. But we don't have to choose, right, between addressing our immediate and near-term energy security goals, and certainly that's been a very strong focus of the work that the Commission is doing, and we've been really delighted to work with them quite closely, with all of you, quite closely over the last months. But at the same time, we truly see this as an opportunity, as I heard the Commissioner say herself earlier today, to really double down in accelerating the investments in the clean energy transition. And I think the examples we just already heard from each one of our panelists is really, truly impressive in that regard. There's a new determination to really put each of your countries and your member states on a real path to sustainable energy, but also a path that will ensure energy security going forward. And I think that really is one of the great lessons from the crisis that we're entering right now. So it's been very encouraging, really inspiring, actually, to see the very quick action that's being taken. It won't be easy. The IEA has, assessed really some very positive trends in terms of the increase in renewables and clean energy investment. But what is going to be required in terms of the acceleration trend is truly significant. We're at a mark of about 1.3 trillion at the moment annually. By 2030, it needs to step up to 2 million, and by 2050, 4 trillion in each case. Those are huge figures, but it does show the level of acceleration that's really going to be required. I think countries around the world are really beginning to think about their energy security in new ways, the need for diversification, the need to, of course, continue to meet, as I mentioned, immediate challenges, while also really keeping the longer-term eye on the ball of the net zero and climate commitments they've made. And we think those two can certainly take place in tandem and ultimately put the world and certainly countries on a much better and stronger path going forward.
So let me stay with you for a minute. What does the IEA analysis tell us about whether the crisis will, or how much will this crisis accelerate that global energy transition towards more renewables, more diversification? And what do you think the trade-offs are that governments are facing in that transformation?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think that if countries are serious about meeting their own commitments, their own stated policies, and that's what we've looked at in our analysis, that there is still a good chance of continuing to move the needle forward. And I have to say we've been very encouraged by some of the recent policies, measures that have come out from Europe, of course, first with Fit for 55 and now with the Repower EU and all of the additional steps you're taking on the regulatory side as well. And in the United States, we've seen significant funding now quite recently become available through the Inflation Reduction Act. This really provides a tool, mechanisms for countries, for companies and to invest in renewables and the clean energy transition and all of the technologies that are going to be needed, I should add, to drive it. Japan as well has announced the Green Transformation Initiative, and we've seen other countries, China and others, India, continuing to step up their investments in solar and wind and so forth. Those are all encouraging signs. But again, I come back to the need for real scaling up. And in that regard, I just make a couple of points. One is the financing, and maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, but the financing available for investment is not necessarily flowing to all of the needed places in the world. And, we're here in Africa, and it's unfortunate to have to say, but that we haven't really seen an uptick at all in terms of annual investments in clean energy investments in the developing world since the Paris Agreement in 2015. And this is an area that the IEA has been focusing on increasingly, but we really need to work with partners all around the world, including the financial community, of course, and the multilateral development banks and individual countries to keep their eye really focused on how we can make that happen. And so there is that big financing piece, which is truly a huge challenge, no question. And the other piece, of course, is we're not out of the woods yet in terms of the energy security challenges we're facing today, and we know very well that they're going to continue for some time. We are already having discussions with the EU and doing analysis ourselves as we look ahead to the winter of next year, not just getting through this current period. And so this is going to be challenging for many countries around the world, to be looking at not only what needs to be done for today, but keeping focused on those longer-term targets.
And I guess there's no other country that is feeling that more than Germany. So we just heard from Mary that we need to keep that. There's some spots that are showing a trend. And if we continue down that trend and we scale up that trend, then we'll be able to do the global transition. And she pointed out to specific policies happening in different countries that are allowing us to do that. There's a critique that there are certain policies in Germany right now that might not go into that direction. Right, some subsidies, coal plants are not being shut down when they were planned. There's some gas contracts that are being signed. So how does Germany plan to avoid a fossil fuel locking at home and abroad, and then move swiftly to a fossil fuel phase-out?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pablo, for this question. First, I would like to emphasize that the most important thing is to shift from fossil fuels as fast as possible to renewables. That's number one. And that's what we strengthen as much as possible. For example, 215 gigawatt of solar much, 60 gigawatt of wind onshore, 70 gigawatt on wind offshore. And I think we must see it's a crisis of fossil fuel, what we see. We used to buy 55% of our gas in Russia. And since 10 weeks, there is nothing. So we stopped it, and we do three things. We strengthen efficiency. We save about 20%, the households and the industry, of the gas we used in the year before or in the 5 years before. And that is a thing which saves energy, saves money, saves emission, and strengthens climate protection. And the second is we make a diversity in the supply, in the demand. For example, we built some new LNG, or we try to build some new LNG terminals for the winter to have the possibility to buy in other countries too. but we will build them in a way we can import also hydrogen derivatives, for example, green ammonia. And we build up an infrastructure where we start in the hydrogen world. That is a very important point. And on the other hand, for example, in this winter, we will need some reserve power plants, but we have an emission trade system. So if we use them more in this winter, maybe the next winter, then they shut them down earlier. In the moment, for example, we come with the shutdown of the coal power plants. It was from the old government planned to go out at 2038. And now for the western part of Germany, we go out at 2030. And we want that too for the eastern part. So we go out earlier from coal. And that all together, I think at the end we are faster than we thought before this aggressive war.
Thank you, Stefan. Kadri, over to you. So, how much does the speed at which the EU bloc moves depends on how fast Germany will move on this transition?
I do believe that every member state has to play its part, but that's true that this current natural gas crisis impacts these member states who were very dependent on Russian gas more than these regions in Europe where they were connected via pipeline with other trusted gas suppliers. And that means that while our solution to get out of this crisis is built on two pillars, energy efficiency and renewables, then Germany has to deliver in this front, and this is worth mentioning that Germany does tries to get out of this situation with the help of neighbors. This late spring, summer, 4 North Sea countries, Germany together with Netherlands and Denmark and Belgium, committed with very high ambition for offshore wind, because wind and especially offshore has vast potential to replace in our power generation some of the fossil fuel plants. And what we see already right now at the situation where, despite of very high and volatile prices, in some regions where they do have more renewables in their energy mix, the prices for retail consumers are still lower than in countries where they are very dependent on natural gas. So this makes sense to accelerate renewables, and that means that while it makes sense, Germany has to do that.
Thank you very much. Really, let's go to you. So we talked about JETPs, we talked about the plan that you have in place, which is great, but I'm sure that there are some challenges. Seeing what's happening in Europe and what the needs of South Africa are, what do you expect from Europe? How can Europe help you tackle those challenges to accelerate your transition?
Some more money, if I must say, frankly. No, I'm just... I think, sorry, I don't want to create that impression and perception that all we're doing is going to ask for funding and financing. I think what it has done is developed quite a strong partnership. I mean, I know that there are specific European countries who have taken quite a significant lead and have solidified our partnership, and particularly the French and the German government, for example, and our ongoing engagement with the German government on a whole lot of different partnerships of work. Some work on the transmission network and strengthening the transmission network. Some work that we're doing around particularly areas as specific around decommissioning of certain power stations, for instance. So there's a whole set of work that can be done in the way that you implement the Just Energy Transition Partnership that is beyond just the resourcing component. There's lots to learn in the way that, for example, the electricity structures within the European Union has evolved over many, many years. and of course something that we for example, moving into a relatively new competitive electricity structure that has not been there before. So changes within the law and the advice from the EU and the EU markets around how that happens. Day-ahead markets, for example, establishing a national transmission entity, how to create competitive generation market spaces, and a whole lot of others. There are also opportunities around ensuring that we can expand and create investment into renewables, right? And I think this is an important area around technology expertise and an ability for European firms to invest into our country around some of these things. So I think it's been an important area. I mean, the difficult conversation for us, of course, is that, and again, we tend to avoid it. How does one deal in how to abate sectors that are tied to our economic and industrial development? How are we going to move from that, in a manner that I think does not perpetuate energy insecurity? And this is going to be an important area for us around a conversation that I think the EU would have to, we'd have to engage on, and specifically on how we look at transition fuel, not coal, but whether gas is a component of us as we develop towards green hydrogen and green energy, right, for those difficult and heavy intensive energy users, whether that's an opportunity for us to be able to look at, and how one looks at the technology development there in that area. I mean, I think certainly, just one more, I think certainly there's an opportunity for South Africa, given its industrial base, to be a global leader, or at least a regional leader in the development of PV technology, in the production of wind turbines and the related technologies towards that. And I think these are important opportunities that we're going to have to look at. And lastly, of course, the just component, because I think the Germans have a useful, and an important experience on how one deals with coal-dependent regions. And as you know, in South Africa, that's all concentrated in one province, where a power station is, there's a mine not far from that, and so it's an entire value chain that's affected by that. So you need to think about what sort of experiences and lessons learned on how best we can develop a proper just transition for people that are working in the coal sector, people that are suppliers in the coal sectors, families, various groups of people that are there, and everyone tied to a particular value chain that I think is an important value chain as it is right now. We need to have that kind of conversations around how we ensure there is a proper just transition in a manner that I think would address the kind of sustainability and the growth of a future South Africa.
Absolutely. I think the focus should stay definitely there. I have one last question for the panel. Mary, this is going to go to you before we open it for questions from the attendees. So final question. So we see this trend, or you pointed out to this trend, we're moving towards clean energy, which speed may vary, but it doesn't seem like the direction is going to vary. So how should Germany, the EU, South Africa, and basically the world consider their relationships with other countries to reach energy security as they ramp up renewables, which is going to require critical raw materials, for example? And how do we then phase out fossil fuels when we know some countries are highly dependent on fossil fuels? Can you give us a peek into the future?
Well, I think you've touched on the answers a little bit there, but just picking up on some of Rudy's points, I think it's really important to acknowledge that countries around the world are at different starting points. Some are much further along in terms of the transition to their clean energy and net zero goals, and others are still at a fairly early starting point in terms of even just meeting the energy access needs in their countries. And nowhere is that more evident, right, than here in the African continent. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And to understand and respect what countries here want to do in terms of developing their resources to meet their energy access goals, their development goals, and their industry goals. So that doesn't mean we don't share the direction of travel, and I think it is important to focus on what we share, what we have in common, because I've been hearing just a lot of shared sort of agreement about the importance of the clean energy transition, investing as you've just described, Rudy, and all kinds of technologies from hydrogen and others. To keep moving that needle. But countries do have net zero goals, as we know. Not everyone has identified 2050 as their goal necessarily. And I think, the direction of travel is really the important thing to focus on. You had a second part to your question.
Well, the second part was the fossil fuel part.
Right. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're going to have two energy systems continuing to work and support our economy side by side for a period of time. And as much as we need to double down on investments in renewables and decarbonization and reducing emissions and pursuing solutions in such areas as energy efficiency, the fossil fuels and hopefully fossil fuels that are lower emitting will continue to be important for parts of our industry for some time to come. There too, we need to really invest in the technologies that will be required to help us, get the necessary innovations to get us to a better point. So we've got a long way to go, and even by the time we get to 2050, as I said, the fossil fuels will be important to some parts of our economy, though we do see peaks coming in all areas, and that is, again, an encouraging sign in terms of the direction of travel.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for the panelists. Let's go to our attendees and questions. I have one out of the back, one here, and one over here. So let's take three at the same time, please. And if you could say who you are very quickly and the question to which panelist is it going to?
Sure. My name is Sangeet. I'm a researcher with the DAW Berlin, the German Institute for Economic Research. My question is for Rudy. South Africa has something like a 70% debt to GDP ratio, and almost all of the 8.5 billion has come as debt, except for 200 million of it. Given that you've laid out this plan of another 100 billion in the next 5 years, and that the major utility, Eskom, is highly indebted, how do the two go together if the new money that's coming is in debt? Eskom has something like 400 billion rand in debt, and the money that's coming to you is also concessional debt, but debt. How do those two go together?
Thank you very much. We're going to take the other two questions. So I have Noam and I have the gentleman over here.
Hello, Pratik Lokhandi from Nuclear Energy Institute. My question to Stefan. So we are here, energy security and climate action. Germany just extended lifetime for nuclear power plant till next summer. So how nuclear energy plays part in your case? Because according to EU sustainability taxonomy, it's green and it helps for climate, and it's also energy security. So how does that play in coming years for Germany?
My name is Noam Wiener, and I'm a CEO of the Sun Triangle. And the question is to the Germany energy minister. If someone provide you a solution, alternative solution for 30% of Europe electricity, by 30% of Europe electricity by 2027, and gradually 10% of Europe electricity till then, would you find the time to consider, before signing on a commitment for 20 years natural gas, which is, we know what it do to Earth, can we find the time to consider this alternative and work together to help you?
Thank you, Noam. If somebody else has questions for Mary or for Kadri, I can take them now. Alex.
Hi, Alex Scott with E3G. I'm really interested, Mary and Kadri, in both of your views on what would be really useful out of this COP27 process. There's lots of talk in the hallways here about what a cover text might look like, what kind of new norms or political signals it could send. What would you find useful from both an energy security and climate change perspective to get out of this process?
Thank you for the question. I think we're going to have just enough time to answer those questions. Let's go in order through the Europe.
Yeah. So, I mean, absolutely, I think this is the point that our president had made and what we've been pressing through the negotiations with the IPG, that you don't want to create a situation where there's developed country financing and you increase debt. And this has been one of the challenges. A large portion of that, about 60% of the total 8.5, is concessional. But your point is right. I mean, I have to admit that it is highly concessional, and so relative to what we would borrow on the debt market, it is actually quite cheap capital, right? Whether we are able to find financing that is free, financing that is, without any debt, is a difficult task, and we've been engaging with different partner countries, with philanthropy, with many others, for example, in the EU, who are wanting to support the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. So we do have a challenge, and we can't push up that. Your point around ESCOM is also absolutely pertinent, because what you don't want, of course, is ESCOM has reached its debt borrowing ceiling, right? In the South African government right now, there's a conversation around how we could relieve that debt. And that's part of the restructuring process. You don't want that debt to go into a new transnational transmission corporation where quite a significant portion of the 8.5 billion would have to go into to develop high voltage lines, both in the Northern Cape and in the Eastern Cape, to make provision for both PV and for the wind components, right? So this is going to be an important area. I think it's part of the conversation that we'd have to have amongst developing countries, right? And for us, certainly, I mean, I think it has been worrisome that we cannot take any more debt. But I think the level of concessionality does help, and it is an important area. We're going to have to, in our negotiations, and politically push for more grant funding. That's at the end of the day. I think we're going to come up with a lot of difficulties in that regard. But this is the reality that we're facing going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging and being so open with the answer. Stefan, you have a nuclear question and a gas question, I think. And renewables, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I try to answer. It's first, I think the taxonomy of the European Union, it was a big mistake, because now we see we won't get rid of the gas. We must get rid of the gas. It's a fossil fuel. And so we have a taxonomy which emphasizes gas on one hand and nuclear on the other hand. And now we see what it means to be addicted from a country who uses energy as a weapon. We see this with Russia. And Russia controls about 50% of uranium, enrichment of uranium, conversion of uranium, producing of nuclear fuel. So everybody who's going in nuclear, who is more addicted from Russia than we were from gas. And that can't be a solution. And on the other hand, it's the most expensive you can do. If you want to ruin an economy, then you can go in nuclear. But if you want a future for your country, if you want a good future for your country, then you have to take renewables, wind and sun, and hydrogen and their derivatives. So I hope that we will discuss again about the taxonomy, because everybody sees now that it's not a solution for the future. On the other hand, we now reduce demand from gas 20%. We reduce the demand from Russian gas 100%. We want to accelerate electricity from renewables to 80% until 2030. And that will be more electricity than today, because we invest in heat pumps. We invest in electrical cars because they are much more efficient than combustion cars. With a electrical car with 10 kilowatt hours, you can drive 100 kilometers. That's only 25% of that what you need for energy if you have a combustion car. So it's much more efficient. And I think we will see the word energy security will have a double sense in future. It means on one hand security of supply, and on the other hand it means security of our planet's biosphere. And that's what we must fight for.
Thank you, Stefan. So now to Mary and Kadri on the question about the signal that this COP needs to send. Who would like to take it first?
Sure, I'll let Kadri have the last word. I would just like to, I'll just make a few suggestions. I think that, again, the way you frame this discussion is really an important point for countries around the world to be acknowledging. We're facing energy security challenges, and we really need to double down on our climate commitments as well. And so I think acknowledging that, yes, today we're facing serious energy security challenges that require practical solutions is important. Second, I think it would be really important to see a stronger commitment with regard to addressing the financing challenges that I touched on. There's no easy solution there, and I know it's being talked about a lot, but I think both the financing issue and the just transition issue, those are both ones that require continued attention. And third, just in terms of follow up to Glasgow, sort of a recommitment to implementation of all of those commitments, and to really doubling down, doing everything possible to achieve the targets that countries themselves have identified. And this goes very much to the issue of direction of travel, to make sure we're all staying on the same course and continuing to move ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Kadri, last word.
I do believe that the outcome of this year's COP is the understanding that energy security and climate action, they are not competing with each other. They are reinforcing each other, because increasing our actions for achieving our energy and climate targets also is our way out of this dangerous dependence on imported fossil fuels. And that means that if we accelerate our climate goals, we simultaneously also strengthen our resilience and security of supply. And I truly believe that during these 2 weeks here in COP27, we do have lots of enthusiasm and knowledge and expertise that actually helps us to bring forward what was agreed already at the framework of Paris meeting. And Europe for sure keeps our promise. Just to conclude, it is important to know for all of us that none of EU 27 member states, none of them, despite the current difficult situation, has questioned the end date for their coal consumption. So it is difficult year this year. Next winter might be even more difficult, but none of our governments has postponed already agreed phase-out dates for their coal consumption. Thank you.
And I'm sure they'll continue having that commitment. So 3 takeaways from me from this conversation. There is a direction of travel. It seems like everybody's going the same way. We need to scale it up with more finance while recognizing that the starting point is different for every country. I want to thank the panelists for being here. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.